Everyone in Harlan's Crossing knew two things about Cade Mercer. The first was that he had built the finest house in the county with his own hands, stone by stone, over the course of 3 winters, working alone in weather that kept sensible men inside. The house stood at the north end of town on a low rise above the creek, with 4 rooms and a deep front porch and windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole structure look, on certain evenings, almost warm. The second thing everyone knew was that Cade Mercer himself was not warm. That is, he had lived in Harlan's Crossing for 6 years. He ran a small cattle operation on the land behind the house, dealt honestly and without conversation, paid his accounts on time, and attended church on Sundays with the particular expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he had made with himself rather than with God. He was not unkind. That was what people said when they tried to explain him to newcomers. Not unkind, just absent. As though the part of a person that reached toward other people had in Cade Mercer simply never fully developed, or had developed once and been carefully removed. He was 38 years old and had never shown the slightest interest in a wife, which made it all the more surprising when, in the early weeks of October, he rode to the train station and came back with one. Her name was Delia Voss. She had come from Ohio, from a town called Millhaven that sat on the flat edge of a river and smelled, she would later say, like iron and wet wool regardless of the season. She was 29, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died the previous spring, leaving her with a modest house that needed more repairs than her savings could cover, and a younger brother whose debts were quietly becoming her own. She had answered the advertisement in the back pages of a women's periodical. Cattleman seeks sensible wife, no complications, fair arrangement, not because she was romantic about it, but because she was practical, and practicality had been the governing principle of her life for longer than she cared to count. She had exchanged 4 letters with Cade Mercer before agreeing to come. The letters were brief, factual, and almost entirely free of anything that could be described as personal. He told her the size of the house, the nature of the work, what the winters were like, and what he expected, which was competent management of the household, and nothing more elaborate than that. He did not ask about her hopes or her history. He did not describe himself beyond what was necessary. He wrote the way a man fills out a ledger, accurately and without sentiment. She read those letters several times over, looking for the shape of the man between the lines. She found very little. But what she found, she trusted. There was no performance in those words, no effort to impress or persuade. Just information, offered plainly by someone who appeared to mean exactly what he said, that, she decided, was worth something. She packed 2 trunks, settled her brother's most pressing debt, closed the door of the Millhaven house behind her, and got on the train. Cade was waiting at the station when she arrived. He was taller than she had expected, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate, without much thought for the pleasure of it. His face was weathered, angular, with dark eyes that moved across the platform with the practiced efficiency of someone who assessed situations quickly and without obvious emotion. He spotted her before she had fully descended the steps, which she noted. She had not described herself in the letters. He walked toward her directly, no hesitation. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she replied. They shook hands. His grip was brief and impersonal. He took her larger trunk without asking and loaded it into the wagon with the economical motion of a man who had been lifting heavy things his entire life. She managed the smaller one herself. He did not comment on this. They drove the 4 miles to the house mostly in silence. The silence was not hostile. That was the thing she noticed first. It was simply silence, the ordinary quiet of 2 strangers who had nothing false to say to each other and had not yet accumulated anything true. Delia looked at the country around them, the wide gray sky, the cottonwoods going gold along the creek line, the long brown grass moving in the wind in slow, patient waves. It was nothing like Ohio. It was larger than she had imagined, and emptier, and she found, to her surprise, that the emptiness did not frighten her. It felt like space, and she had not had space in a long time. The house, when they reached it, was exactly as he had described it. 4 rooms, deep porch, the windows that caught the light. Inside it was clean and sparse, furnished with the bare minimum of what was needed and nothing extra. A kitchen with a good stove, a table with 2 chairs, curtains on the windows, plain and practical, that someone had clearly hung without much interest in how they looked. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and took stock. "I'll need some things for the kitchen," she said. "I'll make a list." "There's an account at the general store," he said. "Use it." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those dark, level eyes, and the way she would come to understand was simply how he looked at everything. Without judgment, but without warmth either, as though the world were a thing to be observed rather than participated in. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and went outside. That was their wedding day. The minister had met them at the church on their way through town. The ceremony had taken 11 minutes. There were no guests, no flowers, no particular ceremony to the ceremony. Delia had worn her best traveling dress, which was gray wool and entirely suitable. Cade had worn what he wore every day. They had said the words that were required and signed what needed signing, and that had been that. She did not mind. She had not come for a wedding. She had come for a life. The first weeks established the pattern of their arrangement with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who were, whatever else they were, both capable. Delia ran the house. She was good at it, better than she had expected to be, given that the house had been stripped of everything unnecessary, and she had to build a working household from nearly nothing. She made the kitchen into something functional and eventually pleasant. She put proper curtains up in the front room. She learned which suppliers in town were honest, and which ones would give you short weight if you weren't watching. And she managed the household accounts with the same careful attention she had given her father's affairs in Millhaven. Cade ran the cattle operation and largely left her to it. He was up before dawn every morning and back at the house by dark, sometimes later. He ate what she put on the table without comment, which she initially interpreted as indifference and later came to understand was simply how he ate. Methodically, without the ritual of appreciation that most people use to fill the space around a meal. He washed his dishes. He repaired things around the house without being asked. Small things she hadn't even noticed needing repair until they were suddenly fixed. They were. She would write to her brother in November, oddly functional. She crossed that out and wrote genuinely functional, which was more accurate and less likely to worry him. What she did not write to her brother was the thing that had begun to occupy her thoughts in the quiet hours of the evening when the house was settled and the wind worked its way around the eaves. She had begun, carefully and against her own better judgment, to wonder about Cade Mercer, not in any dramatic way. Not in the way she might have wondered once, when she was younger, and had believed that marriage would feel like something. She wondered in the particular way of a practical woman who had been given a puzzle with several missing pieces. She could see the shape of him, the competence, the reliability, the absolute absence of cruelty, but the reasons for the walls were entirely obscured, and Delia Voss had never been comfortable with incomplete information. The first crack appeared on a cold Thursday evening in late October. She had been in the kitchen mending one of his work shirts when she heard him come in from the barn later than usual. She didn't look up from her work. She heard him wash at the basin, heard the familiar sounds of a man settling into the end of a long day, and then he stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked up. He was holding something. A small object, flat and dark, that she couldn't quite make out from where she sat. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the flat assessment he wore for everything else. Something older than that. Something that had been pressed a long time under considerable weight. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly. He looked up. Whatever had been on his face a moment ago had closed up again, as quickly and completely as a shutter pulled to. But she had seen it. Just for a moment she had seen it. "Nothing," he said. "Good night." He went to his room and the door closed and the kitchen was quiet, but Delia sat with her mending in her lap for a long time after, her needle still, thinking about the look that had crossed the face of the coldest man in Harlan's Crossing. It had not looked cold at all. She asked May Alderton about him. May ran the dry goods store with her husband Philip and had lived in Harlan's Crossing for 30 years, which meant she remembered things. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman with a gift for distributing information in the exact quantities required, no more, no less, and an instinct for knowing which questions deserved answers. Delia approached it sideways, the way you approached difficult things when you weren't certain you had the right to approach them directly. "He's been here 6 years," she said, straightening bolts of fabric that didn't need straightening. "Mr. Mercer." 6 years in October, May said, weighing out flour with the precision of long habit. "He built that house himself." "He did." Delia waited. May measured the silence the way she measured everything, then apparently decided the situation warranted a reasonable amount. "He came from somewhere east of here," May said, keeping her eyes on the scale. "Arrived with enough to buy the land and not much else. Nobody asked questions. This isn't the kind of town that asks questions." She paused. "He had a wife is what people figured. Before, not here. Whatever happened with that, he kept it to himself and nobody pressed him." Delia was quiet for a moment. "He never said anything." "No," May agreed. "He wouldn't." Delia paid for her flour and walked home through the cold morning air, turning that information over in her mind the way you turn a stone to look at what's underneath it, and finding that the shape of the missing pieces had become slightly clearer and considerably heavier than she had expected. She did not ask him about it directly. She was not sure she had the right to, and she was certain, with the particular certainty of someone who understood what walls were built for, that pushing at that particular door would accomplish nothing except closing it more permanently. So she did what she did with most things that required patience. She waited and she watched, and she let the ordinary days of their life together continue to accumulate, the way water accumulates in a basin quietly, without announcement, until one morning you notice it is full. November came in cold and iron gray and stayed that way. Cade put extra wood in the stove before she asked, which meant he had been watching the weather with the same attention she had. He repaired the barn roof during a brief warm stretch in the second week, working from before sunrise to after dark for 3 days without complaint. She brought him coffee in the middle of the second afternoon, climbing up to where he was working and setting the cup on a beam beside him without ceremony, and he took it without ceremony, and they stood together for a moment in the cold, sharp air looking out at the land below them in a silence that had, she noticed, changed quality somewhere in the past weeks without her having marked the specific moment of change. It was no longer the silence of two strangers. She wasn't certain what it was yet. But it was something different. On a Sunday evening in the third week of November, she was reading at the kitchen table when he came in from outside and sat across from her without the newspaper he usually carried. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at them. She lowered her book. He said nothing for a long moment. She waited. "I had a daughter," he said. He said it the way you say something you have been carrying alone for so long that the words have gone smooth with the handling. Flat and careful and entirely without performance, Delia set her book face down on the table. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was 4 years old." He paused. His jaw moved once briefly, in the way of a man keeping something in rather than letting it out. "Fever. 8 years ago. My wife." He stopped, started again. "My wife went back to her family after. Which was the right decision. I couldn't." He stopped again. He looked up. His dark eyes were entirely steady. The steadiness of someone who had made a long practice of not allowing his face to become a burden for other people to manage. "I'm not telling you because I need something from it," he said. "I just thought you should know why I am the way I am." Delia was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table flickered once in a draft from the window. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded. He looked back at his hands. She would have been 12 this year, he said, quietly, like a fact he had been keeping in a pocket, taking out occasionally to verify it was still true. Clara, Delia said. He looked up. That's a good name, she said simply. Something moved across his face. Not quite what she would have called expression. Something smaller than that. Something that had not been there before, or had been there, perhaps, for a very long time and had simply never had anywhere to go. He said yes, quietly, it is. After that evening, something shifted, not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself, or changed the surface appearance of their daily life by any significant measure. They still moved through the house with the same practical efficiency, ate their meals with the same workmanlike quiet, managed the affairs of the ranch and the household with the same competent division of labor that had governed them from the beginning, but the walls had changed, not disappeared. Nothing so sudden or simple as that, just shifted. The way a door that has been shut a long time shifts when someone oils the hinges, still closed. But no longer sealed, he began to speak more in the evenings. Not much. Cade Mercer was not a man built for conversation. But there would be remarks, occasional and careful, an observation about the weather, a question about something she had mentioned days earlier that she had assumed he hadn't registered, small evidence of attention paid. She found herself listening for those moments. She found herself, and this surprised her, practically inclined as she was, 29 years old and well past the age of surprise, looking forward to the evenings in a way that had nothing to do with the comfortable chair or the warmth of the kitchen stove. December came in hard from the north, and the town of Harlan's Crossing went quiet and closed the way small towns do when the cold comes in earnest, everyone pulling toward their own hearths, their own small circles of warmth. On the first Sunday of December after church he said, "Walk with me." She looked at him. He was wearing his serious expression, which was not significantly different from his ordinary expression, but she had learned by now to read the small gradations. "All right," she said. They walked east along the creek line, through the bare cottonwoods, the frozen ground firm under their boots. The sky was white and low and entirely still. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets. She tucked hers into her sleeves. When the path narrowed beside the creek bank, their arms came together, and neither of them moved apart. They walked in silence for a long while. Then he said, without looking at her, "This is better than I expected." She glanced at him. He was looking at the creek. "What is?" she asked, a pause. The kind that with Cade Mercer meant something was being selected carefully from a larger available amount. "This," he said, and then after a moment, "You." Delia looked at the creek too, the frozen edges of it catching the flat winter light. "I wasn't sure it would be," he continued, "any of it. I built that house for." He stopped. "I built it because I needed something to do with my hands. And because I thought that if I built it, maybe eventually I'd figure out what I'd built it for." A pause. "I think I was right about that. The eventually part." She was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most words you've said together since I arrived." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, the faintest possible movement. "Don't make a habit of counting," he said. She laughed. It was a small laugh, unguarded, the kind that arrives before you've thought to manage it. She heard it herself as though from a slight distance and realized it had been a very long time since she had laughed like that. Freely, without audience, without any reason except that something had genuinely struck her as funny. He turned to look at her when she laughed. She turned to look at him, and in the flat white winter light, beside a frozen creek in a cottonwood grove at the edge of a small town that most people had never heard of, Delia Voss looked at the face of the man she had married for practical reasons and found that the face looking back at her was not, in any sense that mattered, cold. The town noticed, of course. Small towns noticed everything. What they noticed, over the weeks that followed, was not dramatic enough for gossip, but it was sufficient for comment. Cade Mercer, who had always attended church with the expression of a man keeping a private contract, began attending with the expression of a man sitting beside someone he was glad to be sitting beside. He was seen carrying her packages from the general store without being asked. He was seen on a Tuesday morning in late December, standing at the kitchen window of his house with a cup of coffee, watching the road. Not watching for anything in particular. Just watching, in the way of a man who had somewhere to be that he wasn't currently standing, and was thinking about it. May Alderton, who observed all of this with her characteristic precision, said nothing. But she rearranged the bolt of blue wool on the fabric shelf to where it would catch the light properly, because Delia Mercer had mentioned once, in passing, that she'd been meaning to make herself a proper winter dress, and May had a feeling the occasion for it might arrive sooner than expected. She was right. On the 22nd of December, Cade came in from the barn at mid-morning, which was unusual. He found Delia in the kitchen putting up preserves, which was one of those tasks that occupied the hands and left the mind entirely free, and which she had been doing for an hour without thinking about it. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I need to say something," he said. She set down the jar she was holding. He looked at the table rather than at her, and she recognized this as Cade Mercer at maximum difficulty, which was not a thing to make easier by watching. She turned back to the preserves. "Then say it," she said quietly. A pause, long enough that she heard the wind shift outside and the kitchen fire settle. "I know what you came here for," he said. "I know it wasn't for me. It was for the practical thing, the arrangement, which is fair. I wrote it that way and you read it that way, and both of us meant it at the time." She kept her hands on the jar. "But I want to ask you," he said, "whether it's still only that, for you." The kitchen was entirely quiet. She set the jar down. She turned around. He was looking at her now, directly, in the way he had looked at her from the very first day. That level, honest, undefended attention that was, she had come to understand. Not coldness at all, but rather its exact opposite. A man who looked at you that way was a man who was not protecting himself from what he saw, a man who was, in his careful and unhurried way, entirely open. "No," she said. "It isn't only that. Not anymore." The thing that happened to his face then was not a smile exactly. It was the thing beneath a smile, the thing that smiles are built on top of, when a person has forgotten for a very long time that it was there. "All right," he said, quietly. The way he said everything that mattered. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her, and when he took her hand very carefully, the way you take hold of something you have no intention of putting down, she understood with the complete clarity of a practical woman who had finally been given all the information she needed that this arrangement had become, without either of them entirely planning it, a life. The following spring, the house on the north rise above the creek had a garden. Delia had planted it in March, in the cold frames, starting things early the way her mother had taught her. Tomatoes and kitchen herbs and a row of sweet peas along the porch railing that served no practical purpose whatsoever and that she had put in anyway because some things, she had decided, were worth growing simply for how they looked on a morning when the light was right. Cade had built the frames without being asked. She hadn't noticed him doing it until they were already there. When she asked him about it, he said he had measured them from the kitchen window. That was all he said. But it was enough. The town of Harlan's Crossing continued to observe these developments with the quiet satisfaction of a community that had always suspected something was in there underneath all that distance and stone and carefully maintained absence. They were not surprised, exactly, when Delia Mercer was seen in church with a particular quality of brightness that had not been there in October. They were not surprised when Cade Mercer was observed, one April morning fixing the gate of the churchyard, a task nobody had asked him to perform, and that required him to spend 45 minutes in a location from which May Alderton's dry goods store, and the window of it, behind which Delia was that morning selecting thread, was clearly visible. May said nothing, but she moved the thread rack 2 inches to the left so the window light fell on it better, because some things deserved to be seen clearly. What nobody expected, what even Delia had not quite expected, though she was not entirely surprised. was the morning in late April when Cade stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and told her, with the particular stillness of a man saying something he has been preparing to say for some weeks, that he had written to Clara's mother. Delia turned from the stove. "I didn't think I had the right," he said. "For 8 years I didn't. But I thought." He paused, selected. "I thought she should know that Clara had someone, that her name was still being said. In a house where things were good." He looked at his hat. "Is that— I don't know if that was the right thing." Delia was quiet for a long moment. The morning light came through the windows at the angle it came at this time of year, long and level and gold, and it fell across the kitchen table and across the hands of this quiet, difficult, entirely decent man. And she thought about a little girl named Clara, who had been 4 years old and had gone in a fever 8 years ago, and about the man who had carried that alone through 6 winters in a house he had built with his own hands on a rise above a creek in a town at the edge of everything. "Yes," she said, "that was the right thing." He looked up. "She deserves to know," Delia said, "that someone is still saying it. Her name, she deserves that." The look on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not the look you would expect in a story, at the moment when everything resolves, just quiet. The quiet of a man who has been cold for a very long time, standing in the particular warmth of being genuinely, simply understood. The letter came back in June. Clara's mother, a woman named Frances, who had remarried and lived now in Illinois with 3 other children who had never known their father, wrote 2 pages in a careful schoolteacher hand. She wrote that she was glad. She wrote that she had not stopped thinking about him, not out of grief, but because she had never wished him badly, only distance, which was different. She wrote that Clara had been, and remained, the best thing either of them had done, and that it was right that she be spoken of in a house where things were good. She wrote, "I'm glad you found your way to that." Delia read the letter after Cade had finished with it, because he folded it and held it out to her without a word, which was its own kind of sentence. She read it carefully, the whole 2 pages, and then she folded it back the way Frances had folded it and set it on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light would find it. "She sounds like a good woman," Delia said. "She is," Cade said. "We just weren't good for each other. After." Delia nodded. "Some things you didn't need to say more about. Some things were simply the shape they were, and understanding them was enough. By the summer, the sweet peas along the porch railing were blooming in long, impractical, entirely beautiful cascades of pink and white and pale purple, and Delia cut them every few days and put them in a jar on the kitchen table. And Cade never commented on them directly, but she noticed that he always set his coffee cup where it wouldn't disturb them. That was enough. More than enough. The coldest man in Harlan's Crossing was not cold. He had never been cold. He had been, as most people who appear cold turn out to be on closer inspection, simply unthawed, simply waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for something that felt safe enough to move toward. That is what she had given him, without planning to, without even understanding quite when she had done it. Space and steadiness, and the particular warmth of a woman who had come for practical reasons and stayed for something considerably more. He had given her something in return. Something she had not known before October that she was missing. The feeling of being seen, not for what she managed or what she provided or what use she could be to someone's circumstances, but for herself, clearly, quietly, without embellishment, the way Cade Mercer saw everything worth seeing. She had come to Harlan's Crossing with 2 trunks and a practical heart and a letter about a fair arrangement. She had found, in that stone house on the rise above the creek, with its 4 rooms and its deep front porch and its windows that caught the morning light just so, something she had not known she was looking for. A home, a real one, not because the structure deserved the name, but because of the man in it and what he had become, slowly and without ceremony, in the space of an ordinary winter in an unremarkable town at the edge of a wide country where people sometimes found, when they stopped expecting to, exactly what they needed. By the 2nd December, There was a cradle in the room off the kitchen. Cade had built it himself, from the same pale wood as the porch, working in the evenings by lamplight with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood completely what he was making and why. The child had Delia's practical eyes and Cade's particular stillness, and the combined quality of both of them together that made her, from the very first days, a person who appeared to be paying close attention to a world she found, on the whole, worthy of the effort. They named her Clara. They had not discussed it. One morning Cade had said the name quietly, in the kitchen, in the way of a question that was also an answer, and Delia had said yes, in the way of a woman who had known what the name would be long before it was said, and that was all the conversation it required. Outside, on the porch, the sweet peas had been cut back for the winter, but the roots were there, down in the cold ground, patient and entirely certain of the spring. That is where we leave them. In a warm house on a rise above a frozen creek in a small town most people have never heard of, with the morning just beginning to show at the edges of the windows, and a child named Clara sleeping in a room that smells like new wood and lamplight, and the very particular kind of ordinary that turns out, when you are standing inside it, to be extraordinary in every direction. If you stayed with this story through all its quiet moments, the letters, the silences, the slow and honest way two people found each other across the careful distance they'd both built around themselves, there are more waiting for you here. Each one a different place, a different winter, a different pair of people finding their way towards something real, somewhere in the world, in whatever quiet corner you are sitting in right now. This story found you. That means something. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are, and what this story did for you, and honestly, what it could do better. Your words are how these stories grow.